I'm very pleased to be joined once again by Harvard Law Professor Emeritus and perhaps the best known attorney in the United States of America, Professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you so much.
It's very gracious of you to join me. A lot of people saw our initial conversation, which sort of skewed into this area of the constitutionality of mandated vaccination, and it sparked really a remarkable debate that I never expected. Tucker Carlson, Robert Kennedy Jr., even David Freiheit. A lot of people have been talking about this, and I saw you on David's show just the other day. I want to make sure our viewers are aware that since our first conversation back in May, you've started your own podcast that people can listen to on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere. It's called The Dersh Show. And of course, your book, Guilt by Accusation, is available on Amazon. Professor, we were talking quite a lot about your feelings about mandatory vaccination. And now that we've got much more perspective on the pandemic and the vaccine is out, I wonder if your position has changed or how you feel now.
Well, I hope we'll never get to the issue of mandatory vaccination. I hope that enough people will want to get the various vaccines that are now available and people will stand online. I hope the lines will be short. I'm waiting to get mine. You have to be in a certain category. I'm 82 years old, so I'm pretty high on the list. And we shouldn't mandate anything unless we absolutely have to. If we get 70% herd immunity without mandatory vaccines, wouldn't that be better? If, on the other hand, it turns out that we really need to vaccinate to prevent the spread of the disease, and it's imperative that the vaccine not only stop you, the person getting it, from getting the disease, the illness, but it also has to stop spreading communication. As I've said previously, if they were to develop a vaccine tomorrow for Alzheimer's or for strokes or for heart attacks, I would immediately rush to take it, but nobody can compel me to take it because it's only my life that's at stake. And I'm entitled to choose not to do what's best for me medically. But if there were a vaccine that 100% stopped the spread of potentially lethal disease and people refused to take it and it was essential to public health, then the Supreme Court would, I believe, 9-0, maybe 8-1, uphold the power of the state to give the vaccine if it was safe, effective, and absolutely necessary to prevent the spread of illness to others.
Now, there's a couple of things in this argument that you've made that I want to clarify, because obviously you're an attorney and medical science differs quite a bit from the law. So we, I think, need to arrive at a medical consensus before we can legislate or litigate anything having to do with this, but it doesn't seem to be the way it's going right now. So I want to just establish a few terms here, because you've said it several times, this concept of a vaccine that would only help the individual versus preventing them from spreading it. The CDC defines a vaccine as a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease, protecting the person from the disease. So the premise is once you're protected from the disease, you don't become sick and you cannot spread it. So I think there might be a scientific disconnect between what you're proposing.
Not correct. That's just not correct as a matter of fact. It is possible to have a vaccine, and this may be one of them, that gives you, just for hypothetical purposes, I'll put it in extreme terms. It's not in extreme terms in reality. It's possible to get a vaccine that is 100% effective in preventing you from developing the illness, but doesn't have any impact on you spreading it to others. In other words, you won't get sick, but you could be a carrier. If we had that vaccine, it could not be compelled. Now, the vaccines we have...
Let me pause you a second, Professor, because I don't agree that anything can be 100% efficient. Where have you gotten that information from?
It is a hypothetical. So the current vaccines, as I understand them, are in the range of 90-something% effective in preventing the vaccinated person from developing COVID-19. The figure that we're missing is what percent is it effective in preventing that person from being a carrier and spreading it to others. Unless that percentage is quite high, mandatory vaccinations would, in my view, be unconstitutional.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of dangers associated with this because, as Robert Kennedy said, it seems that the the fatal outcomes from COVID-19 are less than 1%. So even a 95% vaccine, if it introduces, as Mr. Kennedy suggested, a 2.6% injury rate, we could actually be harming more people with a vaccine than not having a vaccine. And one of the things that I can't quite reconcile.
I don't believe that for 1 second.
Well, but this is what the data tells us.
I don't believe the 1% figure. It's not true. It varies from place to place. In the best countries, it's 1%. In other countries, it's considerably higher. In some populations, for example, in the African American and minority population.
To make sure your most vulnerable populations get it. In our country, that would be Blacks and Native Americans, people with underlying health conditions, and the elderly.
And then you use the term injury. It depends what the injury is. If it's a bruise on the arm, forget about it. If it's a fever for a day, forget about it. If it's a permanent injury, obviously, morbidity has to be weighed against mortality. And remember, too, that even if the vaccine only did kill 1%, which it does not, it can cause permanent damage to a much higher percentage of people. For example, young people, we now know, tend not to die of the illness, but they have all kinds of potential problems associated with getting sick, and we can prevent that. Polio, when I was growing up, produced crippling injuries to people. They lost their ability to walk.
Well, I'd like to keep the conversation to COVID if we can. And let's take it back to the law for a moment, because this is obviously your area of expertise. Andrew Cuomo signed an executive order disallowing doctors from prescribing hydroxychloroquine, a treatment that's been widely used around the world for 65 years. But he's talking about mandating an untested preventative measure. This seems really odd to me. And we're talking about data from the CDC here. So when I look at the death rate in New York, it's quite staggering. We have basically something like 36,000 dead in a state with 19 million people. And I've heard this a lot, that African Americans are more susceptible to the disease. I don't know that I've seen the study that shows that. And the thing that's very confusing to me is that when we look at an African nation like Nigeria, specifically Lagos, Nigeria, it's a state with 19 million people, similar to New York, only 1,227 dead, according to the CDC. Why wouldn't we send some sort of delegate to Nigeria to find out what they're doing to have such a dramatically better outcome than we have here in New York?
Every country has different outcomes. Every country has different social policies. People are more or less willing to wear masks. They live more or less close to each other. There's no magic solution. But the point is, this is a horrible, horrible disease that kills too many people, that injures too many people. And if we have a vaccine that can prevent it, people should take the vaccine. I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm also very health conscious. I walk 7 miles a day. I eat well. I keep fit. I'm going to take the vaccine based on what I've read. And I will urge my children and grandchildren. My daughter-in-law has already taken the vaccine. She's an emergency room doctor. My grandson, who is a doctor, a medical school student, is waiting online to get the vaccine. And everybody I love, I hope, will take the vaccine. I keep up. I keep up every day with what the CDC says. I keep up with what is happening in various parts of the country and various parts of the world. The main thing is we don't know a lot. And I agree with you. Skepticism is very, very important. And I do want to keep the distinction very sharp between vaccinations that help just the person being vaccinated, that's your choice, and vaccines.
I don't know that such a vaccine exists, Professor. We need to point to facts. Where is there a vaccine that helps only the person who receives it? The CDC tells us that's the way they work. They protect you, you don't get it, and then you don't spread it. You've spoken about asymptomatic carriers in the past.
Not true. We now know that we've heard it from the head of Pfizer, that they aren't sure how effective it is in preventing the spread. They are sure as to how effective it is in preventing you from getting the disease. And so I want to see the data. I haven't yet seen the data on how effective these 2 or 3 or 4 vaccines that are now in the pipeline, how effective they are in preventing the spread to others. Then I'll be able to give you a much more consistent constitutional analysis. Right now, all I can say is, as a matter of constitutional law, to the extent that it protects only you, you can't be compelled to take it. To the extent that it protects others and prevents you from becoming a typhoid Mary, you can be compelled to take it. Put another way, you have no constitutional right to become a typhoid Mary. Or to
We've been through that in our first conversation. Let me just interrupt because you had instructed me to look this up. We've been through that in our first interview. So you told me to look up Jacobson v. Massachusetts, and I did. I've studied it quite extensively. And if I may compliment you, Professor Dershowitz, I'm not a lawyer. I meant to say this at the outset. Neither you nor I are medical doctors, and nothing we're discussing is intended to be medical advice. This is simply debate, conversation, and opinion.
Yeah, on the phone.
People should consult their own physicians before they engage in any medical procedure or any medical intervention. But the Jacobson v. Massachusetts case involved the very first vaccine that was ever created by Edward Jenner. It was created in 1796, which I was shocked to learn. It was 109 years later that the Supreme Court came to their decision in Jacobson v. Massachusetts. And certainly there was a large body of medical evidence and a large medical consensus from which this legislation could be drawn. We don't have that today, so I'm very concerned that there's a lot of guesswork involved.
Exactly the same. The smallpox vaccine that was developed in 17-something was a primitive thing where germs from one person were rubbed on the person, another person. The actual smallpox vaccine that was used in Jacobson was developed much, much more recently, before 1905. And this vaccine is a product of dozens of years of research on related.
Actually, that's not true. This is a totally new type of vaccine.
It's not a new type of vaccine.
It is. The Pfizer vaccine is a messenger RNA vaccine that causes your cells to change what they're producing by injecting a genetic code. There was a live attenuated vaccine that was used for smallpox.
Look, so don't take it. That's your choice. Don't take it.
I'm not trying to argue that, Professor. I just want to go through some of the things that you've been saying, because you're a highly respected individual, and when you say things, a lot of people listen. Only 2 weeks after our first conversation, the New York State Bar Association issued their recommendation that there should be a mandatory vaccine. This was before the vaccine was even available. So I'm very concerned about the legal community getting ahead of the medical community on this, and I think there are some misunderstandings in your argument.
It must get ahead of the medical community. The law.
I'm sorry, I disagree.
Let me finish. The law always has to stay a few steps ahead of science and medicine in order to regulate and control science and medicine. When I taught students at Harvard Law School for 50 years, I didn't teach them only what the law is today. I taught them about how the law will be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. It's now almost my 60th anniversary of starting to teach at Harvard Law School. So I always taught about the future. And the point that I made over and over again is the law has to stay ahead of technology. The law can't be playing catch up all the time. That's why you have to understand what's potential, what could happen. You have to understand what the framework is for analyzing the problem. And the framework was developed by John Stuart Mill 150 years ago. And the framework basically has stuck with every Western democracy. And that is, you cannot compel people to do things for their own good, but you can compel them to do things for the good of society in general. And so if we develop a vaccine that's safe and efficient and that prevents the spread of the illness to others, you can be mandated to take it. If you develop a vaccine that only prevents you from getting the illness, you can't be mandated to take it unless you're under the age of 18, unless there are other considerations, if you're incompetent. But if you're a competent adult person, you can on your own, you can decide whether to have open heart surgery. You can decide whether to have a vaccine that would prevent open heart surgery, but you can't refuse. Look, you can refuse to take a vaccine that spreads to others if you're willing to live in a bubble, but you can't do two things. I'll use the analogy. You have a constitutional right to inhale cigarettes. You're dumb if you do.
You've said all this on our previous interview, sir.
can, but you have no right to inhale, to exhale in my face, nor do you have the right to spread.
We have limited time, so I don't want to repeat what you've already told us. So I'd like to know about an example of such a vaccine that only protects the person. There is no vaccine for heart disease. That term covers a broad range of things: congestive heart failure, valve problems. There's no vaccine.
I'm giving you a hypothetical. Now, there may or may not be.
But in medicine, there are not hypotheticals. We need to talk about the technology, Professor. We can't just make laws and then have medical stuff jam in there. There's a way that vaccines work.
Socrates was a lot smarter than you are.
Okay, let me take you back to something we agree on. You spoke about cigarettes, somebody's right to exhale cigarettes.
Cutting me off. Socrates developed a method which has now been called the Socratic method. It also goes back before or after Socrates, and it's called the Talmudic method. And it relies on hypotheticals. What you do is you first state the concept in extreme terms. You then analyze the problem from a conceptual point of view. And then when the facts come along, you fit them into the hypothetical argument. So I start with an argument that it is not only constitutional, but moral to compel people to take a vaccine that will prevent the spread of very serious contagious illnesses to others, but not to make people take a vaccine that will only prevent them from getting sick. Now, you say there aren't such vaccines. I couldn't care less. My point still stands. If we develop a vaccine, if this vaccine were to prove completely efficient in stopping the person from getting it, but completely inefficient, let's assume we had an AIDS vaccine that prevented the person from developing full-blown AIDS from HIV, but it didn't prevent its spread. We'd analyze the problem differently. That is a very simple proposition. I challenge you to debate it. That there's a difference between...
It's an implausible scenario, Professor, because we can't develop a vaccine that would prevent you from crashing your car. And in the same way, we can't develop a vaccine that prevents heart disease. We need to talk about actual scenarios and hypothetical situations based on medical science.
by focusing on the term vaccine. So let's eliminate.
Let's talk about cigarettes. You spoke about someone's right to exhale a cigarette. I want to give you a hypothetical situation. I think we would agree that cigarettes have no benefit. They're not nutritional. They don't help people. Perhaps there's some enjoyment. But in general, the American Cancer Society tells us that 80 to 90% of lung cancer cases can be linked to cigarette smoking. And there were over 200,000 cases of lung cancer in the United States in 2020. Why don't they mandate that cigarettes are illegal if it's for the greater good?
Very happy to do that, but I would much prefer to have a rule that you can kill yourself through smoking cigarettes, but you can never smoke in the presence of other people. We're moving in that direction. We're moving.
But what about the burden
now.
it puts on the healthcare system? Everybody wants Medicare for all. Should I have to pay tax? What if they decided that people over 80 were a burden and should be euthanized? How would you like that if they just voted for that?
You're now making the exact opposite argument as I'm making. What you're saying is we should be able to compel people to take medicine for their own good. I reject that.
I didn't say that.
You said, what about the burden on the health system? The burden on the health system would say that if you smoke cigarettes, you're going to cause a burden on the health system. So you should have to pay $1,000 a day tax or be precluded.
I didn't say that.
Of course you did. Look, let the listeners judge. Let me give you my hypotheticals now. So a pill is developed. Forget about vaccine. You're just introducing concepts that are not relevant. You have a pill.
That's what we're talking about.
We're talking about medicine. You have a pill. The pill is 100% perfect. You will never have a heart attack if you take the pill. The issue is, should you compel people to take the pill? Here are the arguments. You make the argument that, of course, you should compel them to take the pill, because if they don't, there'll be a burden on the health system and it'll cost us money. I argue no. That's too heavy a burden on the individual. It violates Mill's principles. It violates the constitutional principle. So you can't make a person take a pill that prevents a heart attack. Now, I'll give you another hypothetical. A new pill is developed. The pill doesn't even stop you from being sick, but it stops you from spreading the disease to others. Can you be compelled to take a pill that doesn't help you at all? Doesn't help you one bit. It just prevents you from spreading it to others. The answer to that question is yes. It doesn't matter if it's you or not, as long as
I don't know if hypothetical scenarios are the same as fantasy scenarios. Let me take you back to this interview with Del Bigtree, may I?
Argue with Socrates, don't argue with me.
Okay.
If you don't,
in your interview with Del Bigtree,
when I said that thing on that TV interview the other night, the interview was about a completely different subject. And the interviewer just kind of sprung it on me. And I wasn't thinking about how I was going to respond. I hadn't prepared remarks on that. What I did is I said what I've been saying for 50 years.
Now, that's not the way that I recall our interview, because I had asked you to comment on the constitutionality of Governor Cuomo. Let me play you how the interview actually went. Is Governor Andrew Cuomo allowed to shut down the Constitution because of allegations of a virus that certain medical professionals argue against?
Let's be very clear how we break down this issue. The city of New York, the state of New York, has the power to close a park based on their view that it would be helpful in defeating the pandemic. Absolutely no question about that. The Supreme Court has case after case after case saying that public health justifies closing down parks, closing down public areas. The next question is, does the governor have the right to do that? Governors generally are not authorized to make the law. They're authorized to enforce the law. So you have to look to see if there were legislative authority allowing the governor to close the park. If there is, then it would be legitimate. Let me put it very clearly. You have no constitutional right to endanger the public and spread a disease, even if you disagree. You have no right not to be vaccinated. You have no right.
You notice there, Professor, I didn't spring anything on you. You went into this on your own accord. I was curious that you would misrepresent our conversation to Del.
No, you asked the question. I responded. That was not the subject that you asked me to speak about.
Governor Cuomo's constitutional ability to close the park was what I had asked you to speak about. You introduced the idea of jamming a needle into your arm and forcibly vaccinating people, and then you told Del Bigtree that I had sprung something on you. I did not do that.
Yeah,
What did I
we were
spring
not
on you?
speaking about vaccinations. We were not speaking about COVID. We were speaking about a completely different subject when we first started the interview.
You
Then
brought up
the
vaccinations.
subject.
I
So,
asked you to speak about if it was constitutional for the governor to close the park when we were having
raise the
a
subject. Look,
peaceful protest.
You're having a stupid debate that I have no interest in participating in, whether or not I sprung.
I'm having a stupid debate. You're talking about imaginary medical technology, and I'm stupid.
No, I'm talking
Let me
about
ask you, Professor, about this article in Newsmax that you wrote. May I?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay. You say
I'm very
believe
proud of
science, but be skeptical of scientists. What studies have you seen that indicate that these masks are actually helpful? Because Robert Kennedy indicated that they could increase the spread of the disease.
Now you're being an idiot. The idea that
Okay, so if you're going to call me an idiot, Mr. Dershowitz, I could be equally offensive with you. You, sir, are lying to the public, you are spreading misinformation, and you lied about the letter you wrote on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein. I think that's why this mandatory vaccination issue has been such a big deal. You have no right to be telling people what to do as far as mandatory vaccines. And as a matter of fact, a Freedom of Information request sent to the governor's office revealed that they have no information on the efficacy of masks or face coverings. So you are talking about arbitrary facts that you are injecting into the public for a malicious purpose, and I object to that, sir.
wear masks. Everybody says wear masks. Wear masks. Now tell
You
me
know
about
what?
Jeffrey.
You called me an idiot. Dershowitz,
Now-
you're an idiot. You're
Now tell
off
me
the
about-
show. Get the hell out of here,
tell
man.
me
Stop
about-
spreading disinformation. Stop
me
being a
about-
jerk.
letter.
Call
Tell
me an
about
idiot.
Jeffrey's letter,
The letter
okay?
that you don't
tell me
remember?
about-
You said you would debate anyone who accused you of having Alzheimer's disease. And I asked you about the letter that you signed on behalf of Jeffrey Epstein to Alexander Acosta that got him the sweetheart plea deal for raping girls. It was reconfigured as soliciting prostitution. And when I asked you about Alexander Acosta, specifically saying that he was told to keep his hands off of Epstein because he was intelligence, you
Lie.
had no recollection of it. Lie? What's a lie?
Lie.
What's a lie?
He was told to keep his hands off Epstein because of intelligence. Epstein had nothing to do with intelligence.
That's
You're
what
just
Acosta
lying
said.
to your
I'm not
people
lying.
over
That is what
and
Acosta
over.
said.
You're lying. It's not true. You're
Now
lying
you're
about
accusing me of
masks.
lying.
If
Oh.
I have another minute on this show, please, everybody, wear masks, keep social distance, seriously consider taking the vaccine, and don't listen to idiots like this who are endangering your life by telling
Dershowitz,
you
fuck you.
not-
You're off the show. You're an unprofessional asshole. God, that's the first time I've ever had to say that to a guest. What a son of a bitch, Alan Dershowitz. You are a stupid idiot. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please become a sponsor on Subscribestar or Patreon. What an objectionable guy. Alan Dershowitz is here to inject false information into the narrative. He is a dangerous individual who should not be listened to and should not be trusted. I do want the audience to form their own opinions. I was being very polite. He called me an idiot. He's an idiot. I'll catch everybody later tonight. Let's see what the comments are saying. What did people think about that? That was just so objectionable. He publicly lied about me. He told Del Bigtree that I blindsided him. I sprung a question on him. I did not. I need to get the emails where I said I'd like you to speak about the Flynn case and whether or not it is constitutional for Governor Cuomo to close down a park where we were having a permitted, peaceful protest. I had a much more positive opinion of Alan Dershowitz prior to this interview than I do right now. What an objectionable ass. Really unbelievable. I think we know he has an agenda now. Let's go over some more of the questions that I was going to ask that really just totally unprofessional jackass. He doesn't know a damn thing about science, and he thinks that the law is going to be ahead of technology. That is absurd. he can't even anticipate what this technology is going to do. Alan Dershowitz is a dangerous man who should not be allowed to be involved in any sort of legal decisions that are being made. Now, Alan Dershowitz's first appearance on this program, where he was, volunteering his idiotic opinions about stuff he knows nothing about, that occurred on May 16th, 2020. And frankly, I was surprised that he would come onto this show. He's a big, famous guy, lots of money, hanging out with the Clintons and the Rothschilds and all that kind of fancy stuff. I was shocked, but I figured, it was a couple weeks into the pandemic. Maybe he had nothing to do. Just, figured he'd come on the show. So less than 2 weeks after he made that stupid statement that rocketed around the internet, we discussed this with him briefly there before he became a total asshole. Less than 2 weeks later, the New York State Bar Association issued their opinion that the health law section gave a report that called for mandatory vaccination of a hypothetical vaccination. What Alan Dershowitz doesn't realize is that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that they are trying to force everyone to take are messenger RNA vaccines. Now, people should make their own decisions about whether or not they want to take this vaccine, but that is not the direction that we are being led in. For people who watch Crowdsource the Truth regularly, you're gonna know that I was in Staten Island last Saturday, and these teachers and parents and students are very concerned that they are already being compelled to take a vaccine. Nobody knows what this vaccine is gonna do. It goes into your body, and instead of introducing a traditional form of inoculation, which has been an attenuated live virus or a segmented virus or a couple of different things that have been developed over the years, this new vaccine introduces messenger RNA into your cells that causes them to produce something different than what the DNA in your body tells them to.
Listening to the conspiracy theorists out here telling you not to take the vaccine and all that, man, listen. Let them run through them trials, finish what they gotta do, and when the vaccine come around, don't even sweat that bullshit, man. If you understand, the vaccine ain't worse than the crack era was. If you lived through the crack era, then alright then you know the vaccine ain't worse.
And I was gonna ask him if that legally made a person into a genetically modified organism. I don't know if it does, but a lot of people are concerned about this bill that's in the New York State Assembly right now. And this is a bill that would mandate everyone in New York State to be vaccinated. And whoever went to Harvard and studied under Alan Dershowitz, you should ask for your money back. That is an unethical, rude, he called me an idiot.